The physical design of the Curta is pretty remarkable. Really, it's the thing that makes the Curta special. In my opinion, it's pretty much a perfect design. In production from 1948 to 1970, and they didn't really change a thing that whole time. The most striking thing about it is also the most obvious. It's really small. I'd always seen pictures and videos of it, but it's really striking when you hold it in your hand. The first time I had one in real life, I felt like I was holding some kind of miniature replica of a Curta. But it's the real thing. Smaller than a coffee cup, smaller than a soda can, a bit bigger than Ukrainian Elsa. The inventor, Kurt Herzstark, actually spent decades thinking about the design long before he was able to build it. Kurt grew up working on calculating machines. His dad owned a company that built their own machines, and Kurt was involved at all levels of the company: sales, marketing, machine repair, R&D for new improvements. He was selling these things even when he was a little kid. Kurt said that while working sales for the Herzstark company, the most common question he got was, isn't there anything smaller? Especially people working in the field, they would have to keep heavy, expensive machines either in their trucks or they'd have to drive back to the office to actually run the numbers. Everybody wanted to make something small, but it wasn't really working. In an interview, Kurt said, everyone tried to build a small machine, but no one had the courage for a new system, so they tried to miniaturize the existing technology, which does not make sense. Kurt knew that a truly handheld machine would have to be redesigned from scratch, and his design approach was really interesting. He approached it more like a discovery than a creation. I thought to myself, I'll pretend that I have already invented everything. What does this kind of machine really have to look like so that someone could use it? He was like, well, I know I want to hold it in one hand, so let's start there. With any sort of mechanism in there, it can't be flat, so it ought to be a cylinder. You hold it in one hand and you work it with the other. And if it is a cylinder and it needs to have a crank for the mechanism inside, well, you're not going to put the crank on the side like this. It has to be on the top. What else you need? You need input sliders and answer digits. And we got two surfaces to work with. The top next to the crank, or there's still some space on the cylinder part. The input sliders need to be as big as possible for usability. So let's put those on the large side of the cylinder, and that leaves the top for the answer digits. Kurt put it this way: I designed the ideal machine from the outside first before I designed the insides. But beyond the layout of the thing, the design is masterful. I always love white on black writing. This arrow indicates which digit you're set to in the answers, and this arrow points to the active digit in the counter. The bottom of every Curta has a unique serial number, and it also tells you the model. There was a Type I and also a Type II. Mine's the Type I. There are pretty detailed lists online of the serial numbers. According to them, my number indicates a production year of 1952. The contrasting textures are really unique, and it makes it very satisfying to hold. A smooth, matte black surface next to these bumpy parts. The bumps are one place where a Curta might show some wear. Straight out of the factory, it was all black, but over time the paint wears off at the very ends of the bumps. Those are some serious knurls. The crank has the same knurls pattern, which is a nice touch. The knob also spins freely. This means you don't have to readjust your grip as you go around. And I absolutely love the clearing ring. Most multiplying machines just use cranks for clearing. You have the main drive crank, and then next to the answers, there's a little crank for clearing it. So the natural choice for Kurt would have been two cranks, one for the drive and one for clearing. But two concentric cranks on the end would be a real pain to use. You wouldn't be able to spin one around without bumping into the other one. Kurt's solution is this ring, which is just perfect. When you stick your finger in there, it naturally ends up parallel to the crank knob, so you're not going to move them both by accident. Unfortunately, the ring is also maybe the weakest part on the machine physically. It sticks out past the profile of the cylinder, so it could easily snag on something, and it's just a very thin piece of metal. The Curta itself is pretty solid, and typically it'll be alright if you drop it, but if it lands face down on the ring, you might have a problem. The ring is held on by a screw and this little button here. If you push down on the button, it'll release the ring and let you collapse it down. And in this position, the thing fits perfectly into its original metal case. The case is simple and perfect. There's not really a lot to say about it. The top has a soft rubber plug in it to grab the top of the Curta perfectly, so it's always snug in there. Unfortunately, that soft rubber plug does dry out over the decades, so many Curtas today have something else shoved in there as a replacement. Mine still has the original rubber, but it is disintegrating. You can see in some of my shots the top of my Curta has little specks of the cracked rubber on it, which flake down in tiny amounts every time I put it in the case. The most notable thing about the case is the screw-on cap, which is reverse threaded. Some models of the case even had a little arrow on them to remind you. This is another extreme quality measure. Since there's that rubber plug in the cap, it is possible that screwing on the cap will cause the crank to move a little bit. And moving the crank isn't really a big deal. It's not going to break the machine. But since the crank only goes one way, if the crank gets turned even just a little bit by the cap, then you're going to have to turn it the rest of the way around before you use it, which means the counter won't be zeroed out anymore and you have to clear it again. Kurt wanted to be sure the machine was ready to use as soon as he took it out. My boy thought of everything.